Welcome to the first lesson for Poetry GCSE Prep. We're going to be, over the next 10 weeks, going through some key poems, thinking about how you should analyze poetry, thinking about the structure, the themes, those kinds of things, in something that I call Art Wars. Yes, here's a bit of a breakdown. Some of the most common questions that will come up are going to be character questions, theme questions. Some of you will need to use context, so I'll be talking about that in certain poems and thinking about how you integrate that, model answers and paragraphs, and then also I'll be looking at any feedback that you have, any questions you have, answering those as well. So let's get started very quickly. One of the first things that you need to understand when you're doing poetry is this thing called Art Wars. Sometimes it's also known as Cart War, copyright symbol. I can't, there we go. Okay, sometimes you'll need context as well, but Cart Wars or Art Wars. All of you will need Art Wars because Art Wars is effectively breaking down the poem really effectively. Some of you will need the C on top, the context. So this is thinking about when the poem was written, about the poet, maybe the type of poetry. So, you know, if it's a sonnet, then you might talk about the courtly love tradition. Other poems might be like romantic poets. That doesn't mean they're romance poems. It just means there were these poets called the romantic poets, metaphysical poets, different types of poets, basically. You might need to comment on that as well, depending on the exam board that you're sitting. And the way that the poetry lessons are going to work is we're going to be looking at poetry both as an anthology, because some of you are doing anthology, but also as unseen. All of you are doing unseen. Let me just max my screen out as well. Okay, so today's lesson, we're going to start off with a poem from the Power and Conflict anthology called Bayonet Charge. Some of you are doing relationship poetry, love and relationships, so some poems will also be from that anthology. Next week, we're going to be doing a poem called Mother Any Distance. Whether you're doing power and conflict or love and relationships doesn't really matter, because what you will be learning here is how to analyze poems. We'll do some model paragraphs on those poems as well, so that you learn how to write better for this section of the exam, whether it's for your poetry anthology, you'll be learning from this, or unseen poetry, you'll also be learning from this. Okay, so we're going to read a poem called Bayonet Charge today by Ted Hughes. I'm not going to go too much into the context of the poems in these lessons. If you do need context, what I advise you do is look up, you know, for example, you could just look up context Bayonet Charge, and there's loads of resources that tell you about Ted Hughes, tell you about this military maneuver called a bayonet charge. There are some pretty gruesome videos on YouTube as well on like what a bayonet charge looks like. There are soldiers that have their bayonet, which is kind of like a sword that goes on the end of their rifle, that they're literally stabbing into, like you know, boxing bags and fake looking humans in their training and stuff like that. So just imagine that. Imagine you're at war and you've run out of bullets, because in some wars bullets were quite scarce, and so you might actually have a gun but no bullets in it, so it's pretty useless. You put a bayonet on the end of your rifle. That's a pretty common attachment on rifles, and you have to run through a field where bullets are maybe flying at you, because some guns still have bullets, and you see your enemy in front, and you actually have to charge at them with effectively a knife, or kind of like a fake sword, right? A rifle knife sword thing, and try and stab it into this other person that is trying to kill you at the same time. Imagine the intensity of that. That's what a bayonet charge is. That's what this poem is sort of exploring to some extent. Now, the first thing with any poem that you read, in the unseen section, you want to read the question first. If it's part of your anthology, which for many of you, this poem is part of your anthology, obviously you don't need to look just at this question, but we're going to use this question as a way of framing what we say about the poem today. And we're going to read the poem first. And again, each week also, I'm going to try and focus in on sort of one area of this Art Wars thing. So today we're going to look at the S, which is structure, and think about that a little bit. And then that will also relate to other bits of the poem too. So let's read the poem. Suddenly he awoke and was running raw in raw seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire, hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air. He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye sweating like molten iron from the center of his chest. In bewilderment then he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who had jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. Then the shot slashed furrows threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide open silent, its eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet toward the green hedge. King, honor, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm to get out of that blue, crackling air, his terror's touchy dynamite. Okay, so on the surface, you might read this poem like, what the heck is Ted Hughes going on about? The fact I've told you that it's a bayonet charge maybe helps a little bit. So this is clearly a man that's actually in war right now. But let's focus in on the structure straight away. So the structure can tell us a lot about the poem before we even read the poem. We've read the poem just so you can sort of get an idea of what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the time. So the way that I want you to think of structure is actually a different thing called schleps. So S-C-L-E-P-S. And of course, it doesn't want to all fit on one page. So let me just do that. So the S stands for sentence forms. The other S stands for stanzas. The C stands for caesura. Now, caesura is when there is a pause in the middle of a line of poetry. You've also got the line lengths. You've got the enjambement. And you've got punctuation, okay? Enjambment is when there is no punctuation at the end of a line, okay? So caesura slows pace and enjambment speeds up pace. In terms of punctuation, you can have light punctuation, heavy punctuation. Punctuation can be used obviously to affect pace. And you can also have particular bits of punctuation that are used for emphasis as well. So it can create emphasis. And that can all create a sense of tone. In terms of the stanzas, obviously you can have even stanzas. So for example, they might all be 4 lines long, or uneven. So that could be, for example, you know, a 4-line stanza, then a 5-line stanza, then a 2-line stanza, then a 6-line stanza, or something like that. And then in terms of line lengths, I'm just going to dive straight into this. They can either be even or erratic. Erratic means all over the place. So with this particular poem, if we get a line and draw, I'm going to try my best to draw a line that would fit them all. Let's do a line there. We can see that the poem is pretty erratic here. It's erratic, it's all over the place. So these 2 lines are pretty close to that line, but then it juts out here, goes back there, then it builds up and up and up, then back again, up, 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 back again. So we get this quite zigzag effect in the lines here. So the lines are quite erratic here. There are other poems where the line lengths are all pretty similar, so all of them would be pretty close to that straight line. So if you're not sure whether a poem has good line lengths or even line lengths or not, then the best way to work it out is exactly what I just did there, to draw a line and see whether the line lengths are similar according to that one line that you've drawn across the poem. Okay, so the line lengths are erratic. Now, for each part of this, you might be like, who cares? Why do I need to know about this? This is stuff that is really good for pushing for a level 7, level 8, or level 9 essay in poetry, whether it's unseen poems or your poetry anthology. Not many students get taught this stuff properly. And most of my students will hopefully get bored of this stuff. That's how often I'm going to bring it up when it comes to poetry. So in this case, the line lengths are erratic. So when the line lengths are erratic, that creates instability. There's an instability for some reason because of these line lengths. Now, since we've read the poem, one of the reasons we can say there's instability is clearly from reading the poem, we can see that by the end, he's questioning why he's a soldier in war. He even says, you know, king, honor, human dignity drops like luxuries in a yelling alarm. So he's basically saying, I realized I don't care about patriotism. I don't care about this. I just want to be able to live. I just want to get out of this place and live. So that could explain the erratic line lengths. His mind is being changed and his mind is very anxious in war. If the poem had even line lengths, then usually this would create the opposite. It would create stability. That isn't the case in this poem. Okay, so then we have looking at the caesura. And when I look at caesura, I normally look at enjambement at the same time because I'm sort of scanning through. And I'm also looking at punctuation at the same time, really. So in the first line, we have a caesura and we also have enjambement. In the second line, we have a caesura and no enjambement here. Third line, we have enjambement, no caesura. And then this line again, we have caesura and enjambement. We have both again. This line, we have this unusual punctuation choice. It isn't anything other than that. It's this dash which creates a pause. And then what I've noticed as I go down the poem is there's another bit here. This is very unusual to have a comma and a dash. Then we've got a dash here as well. So there's a lot of issues with this poem, not issues, sorry, a lot of dashes and pauses within the first half of this poem. And we've also got a semicolon, that's heavy punctuation too. So what we get from this is a very erratic pace. In the one moment, we've got this dash and this caesura, which is slowing stuff down. In the next moment, we've got this enjambement over and over again, which is speeding things up. So it seems to be like one moment is really, really fast and oh man, what's going on? And then suddenly, oh, slowing down, stopping. Then really fast again, really, really fast. And then, oh, stopping, slowing. Now that to me sounds like war, right? 1 minute you're sprinting through fields, running away from the enemy. The next minute you're waiting and holding up because you're not sure where to go next. So for me, clearly the caesura is there to create pauses which slow the pace. There is caesura throughout this. You've got another bit here, and you got another bit here, and you got another bit here. But equally, there's enjambement throughout. And actually the enjambement gets even stronger as it goes on. So we have a couple in the first stanza. We have tons in this second stanza, tons and tons. Did not mean to do that. All of these are enjambed lines. Enjambed, enjambed, enjambed. Yeah. So we've got absolutely tons. So if anything, we can say that the pace is getting faster. But at the beginning, it's kind of erratic. It's fast and slow. It's tense and anxious, right? So you've got tension created here and anxiety. You've got tension and anxiety. Now, in every poem that you ever read, you can talk about structure. So everything I'm telling you now is something that you can apply to any other poem that you ever read, any unseen, any part of your anthology. And the punctuation in this poem ultimately seems to get less and less. So if you look at the first stanza, you've got not a crazy amount of punctuation, but you've got maybe 6 bits, 7 bits. Second paragraph, you have less. Overall, you've got maybe 4 or 5 bits of punctuation. And then in this last one, you've got actually probably about 4 or 5 also, in fairness, but you've got, again, all these enjambed lines, enjambement everywhere. So the pace is getting faster. And the reason for this is, I think, because he's stopping, he's thinking about whether he wants to go and bayonet charge someone. There's a good chance he'll die if he does that because he's literally running at someone else with a gun, right? And at the end, he comes to the conclusion, I don't want to do this. I actually want to get out of here. King, honor, human dignity, these things don't matter to me as much as my life. So he drops them like luxuries and runs out of the field. Now, we don't know if he survives. We don't know if he gets hit, but we know that that's what he's trying to do. The final thing that we need to talk about in terms of the structure are the two S's, the sentence forms and the stanzas. So since I feel that the poem is getting faster, what is likely going to happen is that the sentences are going to get longer, or generally the sentences are going to be long. So this is the first sentence. It's absolutely enormous first sentence. It's half the poem is the first sentence. Okay. So very fast pace from that. Even with the heavy punctuation, it's still pretty fast. Then this next sentence is a little bit slower, but still very, very long. So it's still pretty fast. Then we get another one of similar length, and then we get a final one of similar length. Okay. So what's happening, I think, is fairly clear. First sentence, most tense, erratic, and long. Now, this is the part where he is sprinting from gunfire. So it doesn't really surprise me that the first sentence is the longest sentence here, because this is where he's running away and he's, you know, suddenly really scared for his life. The next sentences are all still long, but a little bit more of a second for him to actually think about things. The pace is still fast, though. The pace is still anxious. And then finally, in terms of stanzas, this poem has 9 lines, followed by 7 lines, followed by 8. So that shows that it's uneven. Yeah, so it's 9, 7, 8. These are long stanzas because a lot is happening in these stanzas. And the erratic nature, the uneven nature of the stanzas, again, shows the insecurity in his beliefs, the lack of stability, the fear, the anxiety. So then, once we've done all that structure stuff, we can start to actually now move into trying to do a model paragraph together, just by picking a couple of bits of language. Okay, we'll go through language in more depth in future lessons, but in this poem, a lot of the language is right there on the surface. I mean, you know, you can spend time finding more of this. That's a good idea. But so we have words like stumbling, suddenly, smacking, dazzled, smashed, sweating. Now, those words, when you combine them together, sweating, smacking, dazzled, stumbling, you'll notice smashed, they're all verb choices, right? And they create a semantic field, which just means like an idea in your head of panic. And that's what I'm going to focus on. We're going to think about the structure that I've just told you about. Pardon me, the structure we've just talked about, and also about panic. And also about the verb choices that I've just pointed out. Okay. We're going to move down to the next page, model answers. Actually, let's do it in the model answers section. So the question is, how are the thoughts and feelings of the soldier presented in the poem? I'm just going to copy this down as well. You can access this document from the Discord, or I'll put a link in the description for the video. So how are the thoughts and feelings of the soldier presented in the poem? What you want to do is come up with about 3 or 4 points before you answer your question in the exam. So, you know, one clear one that we've talked about is panic/anxiety. Another one we could look at is questioning war. Another one you could look at with this poem, for sure, you could talk about resentment, or well, easier way of just putting it, thinking about survival, basically, wanting to survive. Now, the one that I'm going to focus in on is panic and anxiety. So as usual, we want to do sort of point, evidence, technique, explain. We also want to have some reader response. I'm probably going to recommend for all of you, especially for your poetry anthology or your bigger unseen questions, to add a second evidence, technique, explain as well. So that's what we'll do. We'll do 2 evidences, and we're going to do 1 evidence, which is the structure, which I've spoken to you about today. and we're going to do a second evidence, which is going to be these verb choices, which I've just picked out with you. Okay, so let's get started. One of the, maybe I'll make this a little bit bigger. One of the ways in which the thoughts and feelings of the soldier are presented are through his sense of panic. So that's the point to begin. Notice how it answers the question, right? How are the thoughts and feelings presented? One of the thoughts and feelings here is panic. So you're telling the examiner straight away, this paragraph, I'm going to talk about how he feels panic. Okay. Firstly, we see this through the way that Hughes, if you don't know the name of the poet, you can just put the poet, but usually the poet's name is in there somewhere. So the way that Hughes structures the poem, okay? So we've talked about all the structure today. I want you to think for a second which bits I've mentioned would talk about panic specifically. Now, I think it's always good to try and marry up the language that you want to talk about with the structure. So with that said, I'm going to talk about sentence forms and the fact that this first stanza is all one long stanza, one long sentence form, okay? And that then makes the pace faster. It's then slowed up by the caesura, and that between those things, it creates this very erratic, tense moment. We're not really sure where he is with things, which conveys his panic, okay? So we see this through the way that Hughes structures the poem. The first stanza is one enormous sentence, which is filled with enjambment and caesura. Now, if you really want to show off, you can actually put the lines in. So lines 1, 3, 4, and 7, and caesura lines 2, 4, 2 and 4, as well as some heavy punctuation. Lines 1, 5, and 6. Okay, so I'm putting lots of structural commentary in. This is all the evidence and technique. Evidence and technique. Okay. The effect, so now we're going into explanation. The effect which this structure has is to create a very stop-start pace, which goes from very fast to very slow and is overall incredibly erratic. Erratic is a word that I want you to use a lot in poetry when things are all over the place. It's a great word to use. Incredibly erratic. This creates a sense that the soldier, that's not how you say it, soldier is panicked, since his mind is racing and so is his body, yet then he is held up in indecision and fear. Okay, so that's our first bit of evidence, that's our first techniques, that's our first explanation. We don't need to do reader response yet. We can do that later if we want, or we can do it here. It's up to us. I'm going to leave it for now. Secondly, or you could use words like furthermore, or additionally, or indeed, or interestingly. As a matter of fact, let's do interestingly. Interestingly, this is also conveyed through Hughes's use of verb choices in the first stanza. And then I'll just put a list. So we've got stumbling, dazzled, smacking, smashed, sweating. These verbs, camera just went off, sorry guys. These verbs all contribute to a sense of panic. So notice how I'm going back to this again. That's what I'm answering to the whole time. Contribute to a sense of panic because they suggest that the soldier, why do I keep saying soldier? The soldier is overwhelmed by the situation he is in. Since stumbling suggests he can barely walk straight, dazzled suggests that the bullets flying in the sky are too much to look at, and words like sweating suggest his physical and perhaps mental discomfort. Okay, so that's our second point. I'm just checking time yet. We've got a couple minutes. Second point, verb choices. So this is language. It links to the structure we've already talked about. It explains panic, explains that feeling that he has. And now we can go into reader response. And some of you will also need to add context. I'll add a context just as a bonus for those of you that need it. Some of you won't need this. And if this was an unseen poem, you wouldn't have to do the context. You would do reader response though. As the reader, we feel empathy and fear for the soldier because he is put into a very scary and dangerous scenario. Contextually, this is significant because Ted Hughes fought in war and no doubt experienced much of what this soldier did. So his first-hand knowledge helps the public to get a glimpse at the thoughts and feelings of a soldier. So see how I linked it to the question at the ending here as well. Thoughts and feelings of a soldier, thoughts and feelings of a soldier. So that's a good thing to do as well, is try and link back to the question occasionally in your paragraph. So there you go. This is probably a fairly decent length paragraph. Yes, 260. For your poetry anthology, you'll also be comparing poems. So in that instance, you would talk maybe about structure in both, or about language in both, or other parts of Art Wars that we'll go through over the coming weeks. But there's a good paragraph for you. If you have any questions or anything, please feel free to add them to the Discord if you're part of that. Otherwise, I will see you next time. So thanks very much for that.